Okay, why don't you try again?
We're back on. And we're sorry for the technical difficulties. The New Heights Church here, we're at the church office, and they're downstairs in the same building, and we're using the same internet. So we were competing for data, evidently, and hopefully David Barr has figured this out, and so we're back talking. We'll try not to get into any conflict with the people downstairs. That would be good practice. But we are sorry for that, and unfortunately that will mean that we'll be shortcutting this particular class. But let's go back to the discussion of conflict, what it is. It's the difference of opinion, it's a difference of purpose when two people or two parties, whatever it is, are frustrated with one another's choices, and it usually involves emotion. We have other names for conflict: argument, or quarrel, or fight, and those disagreements, those kinds of disagreements, are very common in our lives almost every day or every week. What happens when people get into conflict? That's a good question. And I think that one of the things that we see in our interactions with other people, especially when there's disagreements with them, is that our feelings change, our mental reaction to people change. We become sad, or we become angry, or we get frustrated, or we get lonely, or we think that somebody hurt us, or we feel assaulted in some way. And of course that change in our perceptions of emotions sometimes adds to the problem and makes it more difficult to solve. Also, in times of conflict, we get to see the worst part of who we are. We say things that we would not normally say, and later we often regret what we said in the midst of a conflict. We do things that we might regret after we come to our senses or after the situation is resolved. And certainly many times when there's conflict, there's a certain breaking of the relationship that we have with friends, or in a marriage, or between parents and children. It happens in business, it happens in the church, and these relationships, which are fundamentally important to us because of conflict, very often are broken, and that adds to the problems in our lives. Now, on the other side of that, what we find is that the Bible is very clear that we should be dealing with our conflicts. Jesus tells us, in fact, that we are blessed as peacemakers. As Jesus, in his work as our Savior, was the one who reconciles us to God, that relationship is broken, and Jesus mends the relationship that we have with God. So we are to imitate that and to be peacemakers, because Jesus said those who are peacemakers are blessed, and they will be called the sons of God. In Romans chapter 12, Paul gives this very simple exhortation to us. He says, as far as it depends on you, you be at peace with everyone. As far as it depends on me, I'm supposed to be at peace. That is, I'm supposed to be able to deal with the conflicts in a godly way, in an appropriate way. And so God has called us to be peacemakers. So the flip side of a class on conflict is, as you see at the top of your note sheet, make peace, not war, or be a peacemaker. And that's what we want to try to talk about in our class for the next few weeks, Lord willing. I think the other thing that is important to remember is that conflicts are not necessarily bad. They're not necessarily sinful, because people have differences of opinion that are all within the context of thinking in an okay way or in a right way. We just have difference of perspectives. Perhaps we don't understand everything that the person that we're having a conflict understands. Our personalities are different. Some of us are quiet, some of us are louder. And so if you interact with people on any kind of a regular basis, and we all do, those things always come into play, and therefore conflicting situations might arise in our lives. Conflicts aren't always bad. In fact, not only are they natural, not only does it happen, but they're also included as a very important and fundamental part of our Christian way of thinking. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. And then in the first verse of the next chapter, he says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Conflicts are among those things that Paul would include in whatever you do, whatever situation you find yourself in, whatever circumstance, you need to act in a way that's glorifying to God. And so one of the things that we find is that conflicts, interactions with people, are often part of God's perfect plan. They're providential, we say that theologically speaking. That is, God has a particular purpose in mind when He brings conflicts into our lives, and we want to look for how God uses that. We'll look at that a little bit later in our class, but remember that. Not always sinful. God uses them in our lives. And so the question that we have when we come to conflict is, how am I supposed to respond? How am I to grow or develop or respond spiritually in a godly way when we get into a circumstance in which there's conflict? And there's all sorts of places to begin, but I want to begin with this simple little image that you see on your note sheet if you got one, and I have a copy of it here. If you want to, this is my own creation, and you can follow along now. I call it the slippery slope. The slippery slope of conflict. Because you can see that the slope is rounded. And there's a problem with conflict. Because very often in the times in which we get conflict, we can easily slide into danger. And so I have the danger signs on our slippery slope. You can imagine, if you will, here you are in a conflict, and you're on top of this hill, and you're on rollerblades, and you're on a situation where you're at the top of a hill on rollerblades, and the hill is covered with oil, it's covered with melted butter, it's covered with banana peels, it's got a good layer of dish soap on it, and that sounds kind of slippery. And so we call this the slippery slope of conflict. What's likely to happen when we're in conflict? Well, if you're not careful, the way I respond in a particular conflict can be very dangerous. It can make things worse in a relationship. It can cause damage to myself. It can cause damage to other people. And I think we'll be able to see that as we go along. Now, as we look at the slippery slope, I'm going to put up some signs that indicate that there are three sections of the slippery slope. Two of these are dangerous. One is the way, I told you there was danger. I was afraid those wouldn't stick. These highly technical circumstances and means of communication sometimes don't work exactly as we plan. Anyway, 3 sections of the slippery slope. They're called escape, attack, and work it out. We'll look at those individually. I'm going to go through this whole slippery slope, or at least as much of it as we can get to this morning, and then we'll come back to individual sections of this as we go along, but we'll get as far as we can today. The first, and I'll probably go through these rather quickly this morning, and I hope that's not frustrating. You can always contact me with your questions or comments about them. The first dangerous side of the slippery slope is what I call escape. And this isn't my own material. This comes from Ken Sandy, the Peacemakers group, and I think, nevertheless, it's very fundamental. We try to escape the conflict. These are the ways that we try to get out of the responsibility that we have for actually dealing with the conflict and the causes of the conflict. How do we do that? Well, there are several ways in which we try to escape conflict. The first way that we do it is to simply deny that there's conflict. That is, that we pretend that there's no disagreement, there's nothing bad that's happened, it's no big deal. One of the favorite words that people use today is whatever. That's denying. The problem is that denying the conflict often can lead to a more dangerous and deeper problems in relationships. As we go along here, not on every case, but in some of the cases, I want you to try to think of biblical examples from Bible history of people who did things in this way. So can you think of anybody in the Bible who denied that there was a problem? My mind went to two men who were connected to each other, and in one way we would think that they were opposite in terms of the way they reacted to life, but in this particular way I think we find that there was very much a similarity in their lives, and that is Eli and Samuel. Remember, they were both confronted. I'm not going to go into the details of the story. You can look in 1 Samuel for that. But they were both, Eli and Samuel were both confronted by the behavior of their sons. But they both seemed to just go about their business as if there were no problems. It was no big deal that my sons are taking bribes. It's no big deal. And so both Samuel and Eli, I think, display this attitude of just denying there's a problem. Of course, what we find in that biblical narrative is that things only got worse as a result of the choices that they made regarding their own children. The second way in which we escape, or try to escape, is to play a game. It's called the blame game. And we looked at this several weeks ago in our marriage seminar, but this comes up here again in terms of our relationship to one another. Since this is one of the most popular ways in which people try to escape conflict, we're going to deal with this much closer in a coming class, I hope. But blaming is trying to draw attention away from any responsibility that I have for a conflict and placing it in another direction. You know the best example of this, don't you? Was in the Garden of Eden. Just after the woman and Adam sinned, what did they begin to do? They began to point their fingers at each other, and Adam said, but it was the woman who gave it to me. And the The woman said, well, it was Satan. And ultimately, of course, they were pointing their fingers at God. And so we do play the blame game, and we're going to come back to that, Lord willing, in the future. The third way in which we try to escape our conflict is simply to run away from them. To run away from conflict. Now, it's not always wrong to run away from a conflict, especially when there's a threat of some sort of physical danger. But many times in conflict, we just walk away from them. We just avoid people. We refuse to talk to them. We don't even want to look at some people. Look at them in the eye. We don't want to spend time with some people. And so even within households, you find that, well, this person just goes to their side of the house or into their room and closes the door and runs away from dealing with the conflicts that arise in a home situation. Remember, another biblical illustration of that, or a Bible history illustration of that, is Jacob, who didn't want to deal with the problems that he had with his brother Esau. So what did he do? He just left. He left town and he went to live with his uncle for a long time. So Jacob displays this running away, and of course it had consequences later. Again, within God's plan, it was exactly what God wanted to happen. And yet Jacob's response to the conflict that he had with his brother was that of running away. All of these, denying, playing the blame game, and running away, are dangerous to relationships. Why? Because they never resolve the conflict. They never address what the problem is and what the solution to the problem is, and therefore they break down relationships, they break down situations that are worse. So you might want to discuss in your own families, in your own relationships, or think of it in your own relationships. Do I do this? Well, unfortunately, I think in some ways we all do these kinds of things if we just let things go. So, that's the one danger side of the slippery slope. What's my time looking like?
11 minutes.
11 minutes, okay. I think I can do this other side. The other side of the danger is to attack. Rather than escape, we attack. Some people use sort of a passive defense to escape, to get their way in a conflict. Other people use more of a pressing offense to get over on another person. And the reason that we take an attacking point of view is because we want to intimidate, we want to bring pressure on an opponent so as to eliminate any opposition, hoping that if we attack them strongly enough or actively enough that they will just pull away and we will become, so in our own minds at least, the victors in a conflict. Now there are several ways, again, like the escape, that we play or we use the attack form in our conflicts. The first one that I have is what we call put downs. That doesn't mean you put something down. That means that you use words, harsh words, you call people names, so that by calling them names, you hope that they'll back away. Once you call somebody stupid, or an idiot, or a dumb ox, or you say something like, you don't really have a clue, do you? Or, you always do this. You never do this. Every time this subject comes up. Well, never, always, every time is a pretty inclusive term. But when you use that in an attacking fashion, it puts the person that you're dealing with on the defensive. It never helps in solving the problem of the relationship. And so we have to be careful of putting people down with harsh words and name calling. The second way in which we attack is gossip. What is gossip? That's talking about other people behind their back. Most times in gossip, it's true information, something that the person truly did, but it's said in such a way as to get somebody else. Now we're bringing somebody else into the process, into the conflict, so that somebody else, if I tell them that so-and-so did this, and isn't that such a bad thing or an unreasonable thing, we're trying to get that person, that third person now, to think badly about the one that I'm having a conflict with. And now we bring that third party to get them on our side in an argument. Again, that's very dangerous because the third party doesn't always know, or in fact very rarely knows, all of the circumstances of the problem. Of course, the problem with gossip, you see, is that usually we only tell part of the truth. That is, we always say what they did, but we don't always say what I did. You remember how people used gossip in the life of Stephen, the evangelist. They used gossip to accuse the deacon Stephen in the book of Acts. Remember how that ended? Yes, he was stoned to death. And so using gossip, using even true statements to bring other people into the conflict is not a wise or godly thing to do. And then the third way in which we attack people is just to fight them. Let's just have a fight. Sometimes in the slippery slope, the gossip, the attack, ends up like it did in Stephen's case, in murder. But often it begins in a way that we really are not even conscious of, because we begin fighting simply verbally. That is, with our voices. We begin yelling. In a lot of relationships, if you yell the loudest, the other person is going to back down. It's like, have you ever seen those videos of two Kodiak bears who stand in the middle of a creek fighting over a salmon or something like that, and they just open their mouths and they face off and they just growl at each other as loud as they can? Well, that's the way we often get into it. But then fights, many times, in many circumstances, and among some people, end up going from verbal assaults to actual physical assaults. You know what a fight is? A fight is two people confessing each other's faults. Two people confessing each other's sins. And as you can see, both in escape and in attack, there's great danger. The danger is of ruining the relationships. Now I'm going to stop there before we get to the top part, because I don't think I can finish that well today. But take the time, if you've... my danger fell off. Take the time in your family, in your marriage, if you're alone and watching this morning, you can even examine your own lives and maybe your experience with other people and see how the Lord would convict you and instruct you in the fact that very often in the slippery slope of conflict, we can get into dangerous methods of trying to resolve these things. So I hope that that was helpful. If you have questions, you can email me or call me on the phone. I think my number and email are in the bulletin that is sent out electronically every week. Any questions in the class? No, it's in the directory. It's just my name, Gerald Malchus, @gmail. That's my email address. Gerald Malchus with a G @gmail. They named Gmail after me. See, Jerry Malchus. Gmail. Okay. Let's close with prayer and prepare our hearts to worship the Lord in the next hour. Thanks for joining us this morning in this. Father in heaven, thank you for teaching us through these very practical means about conflict. We all have conflict. We had it this week. We might have it today. Maybe we've already had it today. And we see in our own attitudes, in our own actions, dangerous patterns in the way we live with each other. We thank you that your word is calculated and has its purpose to confront us, to rebuke us for wrong actions, not just to put us down in the dumps of despair and anger and frustration, but rather to teach us and to bring us to correction in righteousness, that we may live in the way that you would have us live in our families, in our marriages, in our church, in our offices, and anywhere that we come in contact with people who have different opinions or ideas than we do. Bless us in this way and prepare our hearts for worship in the next hour. We thank you again for your presence among us. For Jesus' sake we pray. Amen.